Good evening. Good to see you, gentlemen, and everybody out there, I would imagine, coming in. My name is Quinn Jacobson. Welcome to another week of the Studio Q show live. We got people climbing in on YouTube as we speak. We'll give them a minute. Tom, howdy. Great day for negative thoughts exposure-wise, that is. Good morning, Will. Yes, we're gonna start a whole thing on negatives. And we're going to approach it a little bit differently this time because I'm going to show you, this is a lead-in to what I'm going to do. So good afternoon, Linda. Good to see you. Good to see everybody. So how's everybody doing? I hope you're well, happy, healthy, all that good stuff. Good. Good to see you, Pablo and Jeffrey. Awesome. And we have a cool day on the mountain here. We have 13 degrees and overcast. So it's nice and cool. Got some rain last night. I'll show you a little update here, what we're doing. It's beautiful. I love it. So been keeping very busy, needless to say. So welcome, everyone. Let's jump right into this and get going because at the end of the day, that's what we're here for, right? So let me share my screen. And people will come on in when they're ready. Let's do this, view, present, good deal here. Today is July 24th. It's incredible, at least here right now as I speak. It may be tomorrow for you or yesterday for you, but the month of July is just going so fast. So we're going to start a series on making wet collodion negatives. I've added a couple of things to my list here. We're going to look briefly at a couple of pages from Monckhoven's book, Popular Treatise on Photography. It is translated into English by Thornthwaite, I guess is his name. W.H. I don't know all these gentlemen that's done all this work, but we appreciate that. And we're going to look at my darkroom studio build. I just went out and snapped a photograph 5 minutes ago. We'll get to see that. We'll do technical questions and answers, and I'm going to introduce you to People of the Red Earth, or my new project, that this will directly correlate with making negatives and prints, or in my case, well, prints, yeah, on glass. Hello, Thilo. Olympics have started. Okay, they didn't cancel those. He's in Japan, so they started the Olympics. I thought they might cancel those. And Will says, doing great, just waiting on my links to come in this week. Quinn, you got me in the Rollins book. Oh, good. Excellent. That's wonderful. And there's Thilo says, Olympics have started. Well, I thought they might cancel it because of COVID, but I guess not. Hello, Paul. Good to see you, brother. Good to see you. Paul and I have been chatting. He's a very good conversations with Paul. He has a little bit of intro on my project as well. So let's jump right in here and do this. Let's start with the darkroom build update. For those of you that haven't seen what I've done up here, when I say up here, I'm on top of a mountain. I'm on a mesa in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. It took me about 2 months to get this foundation poured and set. And between the red tape of getting permits and doing this and paying for that and all this stuff, the rain, getting people up here to do this work, I've complained about that endlessly. It was a big accomplishment to get the foundation done. This is a 600 square feet or a 56 square meter building that I'm putting up. It has a north-facing 10 by 10 foot, or a little over 3 meters, directly facing north for that beautiful actinic light. And we're at 8,500 feet or 2,590 meters above sea level. So the UV up here is absolutely insane. You can only imagine. Hey, Steve, ciao, brother. Yeah, Thilo says too much money involved to cancel the Olympics, I would imagine. So that's my foundation. That took me about 2 months to get in. We've been working on it for about 6 or 7 months with the excavation. I had to level the pad and do all that stuff. Hey, look at that. James came in. Hello from Castle Rock. Castle Rock's about, an hour and a half, 2 hours maybe 2 hours from me, north there. Good to see you, James. So this took me a while to put together, and I give updates on social media, but I know a lot of folks don't do social media, and I don't blame you. And this is what it starts looking like. This is a steel building. It's 20 feet tall, 6 meters tall. It's 20 feet wide, 6 meters wide, and it's 7 meters, 8 meters long, so to speak. So it's a steel building, very strong, very durable, made to stay here, made to really push out the snow and the wind and whatever we get up here. This will be completely off grid. I no longer am going to use artificial light. I'm not going to do any of that stuff. This is all going to be off grid, and the well water is going to supply my water for the darkroom. The darkroom will be on the west side of the building. I'll show you here. Over here on the west side, this is the 10 by 10 opening for that beautiful northern actinic light here. It's just unbelievable. This is the crew working on it yesterday. So you can see the skins going up on it, getting enclosed. And that's kind of what I've matched the house. You see over here, my garage, and my house is attached on my garage over there. So you can see I can just walk out. There's my greenhouse. I can just walk down to the studio. And here's our guest accommodations beyond the studio there. 24-foot camper trailer. It's very nice. We lived in it while we were building up here. It's very nice. Well, hello, Peter. Good to see you. And April, welcome back. Welcome back. Good to see you guys. And so that's the building as of today, or very early this morning. But now I've gone out and I made another photograph of it. There it is, about 5 minutes ago. They're out there working on it right now. So this may be completed today, at least closed in. So I still have work to do, but that's my update. I'm super, super excited for this. I've been waiting for it for a long time. So just to give you a little update, for those that are interested, if you're not interested, buzz through this. That's not a problem. So let's jump into Mr. Van Monckhoven's book. This is a complicated book because he goes into details about making collodion that we don't have to suffer through. I've translated all this. I just want to hit on some points about what he talks about with collodion. Here you can see he's talking about ether and the specific gravity of the ether, the alcohol, the specific gravity of the alcohol, the gun cotton, the cadmium iodide, and the cadmium bromide. And I've kind of translated this all the way through. He has a number 1 and number 2 for thickness. We've talked a little bit about this in the past, the thickness of collodion. But I'm going to translate it for you there at the bottom real quick. So the gun cotton, ether, cadmium iodide, and cadmium bromide. You can see his recipe there at the bottom. If you wanted to make some of that, that's where he's at with. This is all making negatives, by the way. So plain thick collodion without iodides or bromides is first prepared as follows. So one of the things that kind of fascinated me for a long while was no one ever talked about, at least early on, no one ever talked about making iodides and keeping the plain USP collodion separate and mix those when you want to use collodion. All these old boys did it. It's all over in the literature, even up into the Kodak wet plate. We'll look at that next week. But even Kodak's using it into the 20s and 30s about separating these two things out, not just mixing it all together. And you know, Jeffrey said in your email there, and it's true, when people first start out, that's why I really emphasize making the iodizer and keeping it separate from the collodion. You make a bunch of collodion and life happens and you don't get to use it, and you go back and it's all gelatinized and completely dark red, and you know, you don't want to try to revive that. It's a big complicated mess. But this is really important, and that's what I emphasize in my book, is making the iodizer and keeping it separate from the plain USP collodion. That does two things. Number one, it allows you to make collodion, just enough collodion to get by. If you're going to only make 10 plates this month, you might only make, 150 mils of collodion, working photographic collodion. And number two, it allows you to stabilize your ether, because your iodizer has alcohol and ether in it, and alcohol is a great stabilizer for ether. And if you don't know what I'm talking about there, you'll have to go back and jump into some of these videos that we've done on chemistry, handling, maintaining, and all that stuff. Ether can produce peroxides. They're rare, but they can. Once ether gets oxidized, it can produce peroxides, which are extremely dangerous, highly explosive, et cetera, et cetera. All the ether nowadays has an inhibitor in it, but still, once you mix that iodizer, together with the ether, alcohol, and the salts, you're stabilized, you're good. And it keeps your salts a little longer, or, you know, stabilize your ether, it does all that stuff. So anyway, this is what he likes to talk about in his Popular Treatise on Photography about thick collodion and mixing collodion together. So he breaks it down into these steps. I'm just going to synthesize this, and we just want to hit a couple of points here. So he says over here on the right side, he says, but it is improved by being kept a few hours after sensitizing before being applied. Because he's using this very strong cadmium iodide, this is very resistant to breaking down, unlike ammonium iodide, which breaks down very fast and basically degrades very fast, turns your collodion an orange, a yellow and orange, and then a red fairly quickly. He says it's best to keep it a few hours. Both the plain collodion and the alcoholic solution of iodide and bromide of cadmium can be preserved for any length of time without deterioration. That's really a good point, because he's using cadmium iodide and he's separating the iodizer from the plain USB collodion. Provided they are kept separate and in well-closed bottles, and sensitized collodion can therefore be prepared when required with great facility, meaning it's convenient. It saves you time and money and all. You don't have to worry about your collodion breaking down, turning red, and gelatinizing before you ever get to use it. The formula for sensitized collodion just given will be found to work best at a mean temperature of 60 degrees Fahrenheit, about 12 degrees Celsius, 12, 13 degrees Celsius. I was talking about optimal conditions for collodion. Collodion likes it cooler. Doesn't like it hotter, it likes it cooler. Everything in the process likes it cooler. So he's calling out a 60 degree Fahrenheit working temperature. When the weather is very hot, a little more alcohol must be added and the quantity of ether slightly diminished. And on the contrary, when the atmosphere is very cold, the alcohol may be diminished and the ether increased. So he's talking about colder and hotter temperatures. You can adjust your solvents. That's why it's kind of a misnomer to just give this absolute recipes for these things, because there's always wiggle room in collodion, in developer, you know, there's always these wiggle rooms. You have to adjust for your conditions, especially making negatives. Hey, Farad's in the house. Good. Let's see. He says, Quinn, I just went over my negative process and had to leave the plate. Oh, had to leave the plate in the room with burning ice. What's happening with iodide during the activity plate silver? We'll get to that. That's a good question. We'll come back to that on the Q&A. So he goes on to say, it will therefore be easily understood that after a considerable number of plates have been coated, the proper relative proportion of the constituents of the collodion will have been disturbed by evaporation. So we've talked about this. I tell you about pouring your collodion on the plate. You've got all that ether, especially ether, evaporating off that plate. You pour it back into the same bottle you pour from. You're going to start, your solvents are going to start diminishing, especially your ether. That's why I recommend using a drain bottle, so you can drain that excess collodion off your plate into a drain bottle and then reconstitute it. And that's what he's talking about here. Nothing in my book is new. I've gathered all this from this 19th century literature. They talk about it over and over and over again. It's hard to miss if you read any of the literature. So I haven't made anything. I may have adjusted some things here and there, but this is where my instructions come from, or these this primary literature. So he talks about disturbed by evaporation, and that both ether and alcohol must be added to bring it to its normal condition. I call that reconstitution. You look in my book, I recommend a little more ether than alcohol, or you can do 50-50 depending on your environment. In the drier climates, you want to do 50-50. In the more humid conditions, you want to have a little more ether. But they call it Q.S, quantity sufficient to reconstitute. So a larger relative proportion will have evaporated, and consequently a larger quantity of ether must be used than of alcohol. So there you go. This is kind of a rehashing of this basic kind of collodion and using it, draining it, all that stuff. So here he goes on about coating the plate. I do not do this pinch method. A lot of people do, and it's perfectly fine. Again, no gospel on what's right or wrong here. It's getting that beautiful layer of collodion that's balanced, that doesn't have heavier collodion on one end than the other. He pinches the plate. You can see there in that figure 30 illustration. I use what's called the waiter tray. I hold it like this, pour it on, and drain it off. He uses that pinch method. The reason I don't like to use this is because you have to avoid your thumb up here. And once you avoid your thumb right there, if you're not coated with gelatin or albumin completely, just your edges, you may have some lifting occur. And we'll talk about that in a minute. He goes on to say, 1, if the plate is immersed in the bath before the collodion has been allowed the time to set, right? Or we call it skinning over, the film will become detached in fragments. And in this case, it will be necessary to filter the bath. So if you pour your plate and you don't wait the proper amount of time, and that's going to vary too on your conditions, and you throw it in your bath, it's going to detach from your plate. You're going to have pieces of collodion all over in your bath. 2, if the immersion takes place right at the right time, the film whitens gradually, right? So if you have a box or a pan, a tray that you can watch this, you want this gradual conversion, this double decomposition into silver iodide, silver bromide on the plate. It looks white under red or yellow light. If, on the other hand, the film be allowed to become too dry before immersion, it whitens instantly, and good proof that is never attainable under and a good image is never, or a negative is never obtainable under those conditions. So if you let your plate dry down too much, if you let it skin over too much, that process is it's gonna appear white immediately, and you're not going to have a good negative. Up to a certain point, it is not difficult to determine whether the plate should be immersed in the silver nitrate bath. It will be found if the plate is looked at in a certain light, it has assumed a dull, unpolished appearance. And what he's talking about there, if you reflect your red light onto it, you can see it comes in really shiny, right? And when you pour it on the plate. And once you start seeing it skin over, it'll dull down. It's something you have to do by experience, but this is really important, because if you miss that time for immersion, you're going to have problems with trying to make a negative or even a positive. This, which is the right moment for immersion, will be arrived 20 seconds while in the winter, and it will probably take 60 seconds. Oh, in the winter in the summer it'll take 20, he says. In the winter it takes 60. Those are rough numbers, right? All he's saying, when it's warmer, it's going to skin over faster. When it's colder, it's going to skin over slower. That's all he's saying there. So he goes on to say, the same filter will last a long time. On leaving the work, the silver bath, which has been used during the day, is poured in the filter, and in this way the solution is proper condition, always maintain it half. This is what I call in my book regular maintenance, day to day. You have a session, you make 10 or 15 or 20 plates. At the end of the day, you put your silver bath, you empty your tank out into your bottle with a funnel, and I use brown coffee filters and cotton rounds. You clean all that stuff out. It gets to aerate a little bit. That's just regular maintenance. Then you store that bottle away. And it's good. It's a good habit to get into. I told you the story about people calling me up and saying, oh, my silver bath has been out there for 6 months. I've never done anything with it. It's like, well, that's probably part of the problem why you can't make your images aren't so great. He goes on to say here, if the collodion film detaches itself from the glass plate after being sensitized in the silver bath, it indicates that a larger proportion of ether is required. So when people go on about this poor boy collodion, where they eliminate the ether, this is one of the problems you're going to face here. It's going to detach from the plate, the glass plate, even if your plate is clean. Ether has everything to do with adherence and hardness of the film or the collodion. Or that the gun cotton employed is not suitable, he goes on to say, in which case recourse may be had to a gun cotton prepared according to the formula given in note 3. He's just talking about, more grains of gun cotton or nitrocellulose, and which produces a very adhesive collodion, especially applicable when glasses of large dimensions are employed. This is why you're going to have a much more difficult time making larger plates with etherless collodion. There's no such thing. Collodion has about 70% ether in the bottle as it is. So when you eliminate the additional ether and you try to do large plates, you're going to have detachment more than likely. You're going to have that happen. And your collodion is going to be very, very fragile, like wet toilet paper. I've ran cotton balls over additional etherless collodion, and it just pulls the collodion right off. My collodion is like tough as nails, man. I can abuse that stuff and wipe on it and do all kinds of stuff. If too much alcohol be added to the collodion, the film is liable to become detached, and the coating itself has a wavy, uneven appearance. Here's another issue with additional etherless collodion. And the coating itself has a wavy, uneven appearance. And that's what you get, these ripples. You've seen those. If there's too much ether, the layer is very adhesive, but it is difficult to get the collodion to spread itself evenly over the plate, especially if it be a larger size. So if you're using cadmium bromide and you're using a lot of ether, you could get, people think you're thinning collodion out with ether. It appears that way, but you're going to have a hard time moving that around for us. It's the opposite problem we're talking about. Collodion ought to be preserved in well-stopped bottles, but it's indifferent whether bottles with glass stoppers or furnished with good corks be employed. He says it doesn't matter, just as long as it has a good seal on it. They ought to have however, as much as possible, kept quite full in the dark. And I add to that, in the dark and cool. That's why I use a cooler and all that stuff we've talked about. Iodized collodion is never good the first day of its preparation. This collodion he's talking about, at least. It must be kept for at least 2 days to acquire all of its properties. Excuse me. Neither must be kept too long, for impressions are then taken with it less. It becomes slower once it starts breaking down. And man, you're using cadmium iodide, you're not going to see that for a long time. He likes to have it a yellow color, a straw yellow, and he even says maybe even colorless here. Again, this is making negatives. I just want to emphasize this. Iodized collodion is, collodion is very unstable. Sometimes without any apparent reason, it becomes slow in producing impressions. At other times, it changes to a red color at the end of a few days. I get these emails all the time. In the latter case, recourse ought to be had to a new preparation and take it. So what he's saying, if you turn really red in a few days, he's going to blame that on an acid not washed out of the nitrocellulose or the ether, the sulfuric acid, something. And this was common back in the day. It's happened twice in 20 years for me here. Ether turning your collodion not red but pink, and never having any problem with anything else. So he's saying make a new batch. So if the materials previously employed were sufficiently pure. The color of good collodion is commonly of a very light lemon color, although sometimes completely colorless. That's an interesting comment there, because when we talk about iodine being released as in NH4I's case, it changes color. It becomes richer, right? But we're talking about making negatives here. So a very clear and perfectly settled collodion must always be made use of. The following is an excellent little apparatus for pouring out collodion free from sediment. He goes on to say, and you can download this book, Google Books, or go grab this book. You can read all the detail. He goes into massive detail about decanting. He's a big advocate of not using the bottom of the collodion and all this stuff. They made these perfect, beautiful negatives back in the day and positives. Then chapter 6, he goes on to talk about his silver nitrate. And I just quickly translated that. That's about an 8% solution, about a 35, 40, 38 grain bath, right? Somewhere in there. And again, we're just going to quickly go over these just so you get an idea here. So development, this is where we're going to change up a little bit. This is where it's going to change in what you might be used to doing. Even if you make negatives now, this may give you some insight to try something new or something different that you've never done before. So he goes, this is chapter 9. He goes on to say, it can, however, be made apparent by covering the surface which has been exposed to light with a solution of some substance capable of reducing the salts of silver to the metallic state. Again, the same process with positives and negatives as positives. You're taking those silver iodide, silver bromides, pouring on positives, you're pouring an iron base, and sometimes negative, doing soft ones. You're pouring some reducer to reduce those salts to the solid metallic state of silver. Among the reducing agents which can be employed in photography may be mentioned protonitrate of iron, sulfate of iron, pyrogallic acid, protosulfate of uranium, protosalts of osmium and titanium, etc. But all of these pyrogallic acid will be found the best for developing the negatives, and protosulfate of iron for obtaining direct positives on glass. So there he says it. If you're making negatives with ferrous sulfate and you really want negatives, you don't want a soft negative, and I'm going to show you an example of that here in a minute, go for the pyrogallic acid developer and negatives. And we're going to talk about this recipe right over here next, or in just a second. If a small amount of moisture be present, however, the decomposition proceeds with increased speed, being expedited. I'm just translating a little bit. Being expedited by foreign matter which it contains. Thus it is better first to keep the pyrogallic acid bought in shops in a small stoppered bottle. Secondly, to keep it in the dark. And thirdly, never to prepare it with more developing solution that is likely to suffice for a day's consumption. We'll get to Jeffrey's question, but he asked one of those questions. So pyrogallic acid is really prone to oxidation. And so once you mix it up, even in the bottle, you want to keep it tight, dark, cool, all that stuff. So you only want to mix enough to use for that particular day or that session. It is usual to add the pyrogallic acid, some other acid, as much to preserve the solution as to develop the picture uniformly. Distilled water also must be employed, or at least rainwater, well filtered. That which is obtained during a storm contains ammonia or nitric acid and is therefore unfit for use. Do you get that? Acid rainwater. So if you live in an area, and this is 1863, if you live in an area that you've got industrial stuff going on and it rains, don't think you can use that rainwater. But guess what? Where I live, you can. There's no acid rain up here. It's clean, clear water. It's almost distilled. So let's talk about this wonderful distill, and I'm going to give you this at the end of this. I'm going to give you all these recipes. Let's talk about this wonderful pyrogallic acid developer for negatives. And what Monckhoven says, he says, and he gets this from Devon and Gerard, having proposed a substitute for citric acid of the acetic acid. And so they were using glacial acetic acid as the restrainer in the pyro. And now Devon and Gerard says, no, use citric acid. So 1,000 mils of distilled water, or DH2O, 3 grams of pyro, and 3 grams of citric acid. That's your negative developer. And believe me, it works very well. It's super efficient. You're not going to get your positive stuff. You're not going to get the soft negative. It's not going to look like a good positive. I'm going to show you a video in just a second on what I mean there. He goes on to talk about the plate on removal from the frame is held by one corner, the same which was held with a collodion. He goes on to talk about how to develop this. He says, continuous operation on the collodion surface and the plate inclined alternately in every direction. What he's talking about is you don't want to have, same with your collodion, you don't want to have a buildup on one end and thin on the other, or vice versa. Same with pouring the developer on. You want to keep it moving on the plate, if you will. And so here's this little illustration, developing a negative proof by holding the opposite corner from whence the liquid flowed onto the glass. You see my technique. I flow on, I pour off, I pour back on, and then I move it, and I keep it flowing. The least amount of developer you can use maintains this free silver on the plate, which will help, especially in negatives, and help in positives too. But you just don't want anything uneven on that. The same solution is, again, poured on the plate, like I said. Again, this is where I get a lot of my technique from, right? Inclining it constantly right to left in order that the liquid be kept in a continual motion. That's what I say. Keep that moving. Keep a little amount, pour it off, catch as much silver you can, cover the plate well. Same thing, positives and negatives, same thing. The process of developing the picture, although apparently simple, it is nevertheless a very delicate one. People come into workshops and say, man, I've been using heavy whipping cream or heavy milk or cream milk, pouring on glass plates, practicing collodion. I said, you wasted your time. The developing technique is where you're going to have problems. And every single time that happens, it's not the collodion. They get the collodion down in 2 or 3 pours. Developing, that's where you're going to see your artifacts. That's where you're going to see your islands, your your streaks, your sweeps, all of that stuff, and uneven, all of that. You're going to see all of that. So developing technique is definitely the most difficult for most people. And it goes on to say, and one which depends in great measure the success of the positive proof, meaning the print. He says, if you don't get your development right on the negative, your prints are going to look like shite. They're not going to look good. Sorry. It will not, therefore, be out of place, excuse me, to enter a little more into detail. The latent image produced by the action of light upon the silver iodide is brought out by the action of pyrogallic acid, aided by the silver nitrate with which the collodion film is impregnated. Meaning the free silver acts with the pyrogallic acid to develop your, just like the positive, right? If too much pyrogallic developing solution is poured from the developing glass on the plate, the details of the picture appear but slowly. And if too little, there will not be enough to cover the plate completely. Thus, the medium line between the two extremes. That's what I talk about. Utilizing the free silver on the plate, comes out of the bath, make your exposure, brings back in. You still have all that free silver on the plate. You want to maintain as much of that as you can for density. We're going for density here on this negative, right? So he goes on to say, he find that balance. Sufficient developing solution should be poured into a glass to cover the plate freely and completely, and no more. And this should be poured on and off as allowed to flow in various directions in order to facilitate the mixture of the developer with the adherent silver nitrate. So again, he's just saying that over again, right? Really important for negatives. Negatives will show on the print things you don't even see in it. It will just, it's not forgiving like the positive. Positives are like Polaroids, kind of knock off Polaroid stuff, right? You get away with murder on technique and everything else with those. Negatives, you won't. If you want a good clean print, is what I'm saying. Again, this is like the creme de la creme, the top of the heap here. By methods of manipulation, it will be found that the development proceeds uniformly and may be observed from time to time by examining the plate by transmitted light. And he gives a figure 59 on that. And what he's doing is just holding it up to the light to see what its density is. You get used to doing this. You don't really have to do that. You can if you're not used to it, but you just keep going. It's not a 20-second development. We'll talk about that in just a second. At an ordinary temperature, the picture is generally sufficiently developed in 2 minutes. Mine run from 45 seconds. I've had them as little 30 seconds to a minute and a half, something like that. And, you know, these variables, it's really hard to say, but it's not 15 seconds like we do positive, right? So you do have time to kind of look and see if you want and all that kind of stuff. So 2 minutes. But if it's necessary to force development, it will seldom prove successful. So don't push it, right? Have your chemistry right, have your exposure right, know what you're doing, do your positive test, know how to do all this stuff. I'm going to give you a video here in just a second. At a higher temperature, it sometimes becomes necessary to stop the development in a half minute. And that's probably what I'm talking about there, temperature-wise, to prevent the highlights from becoming too dense. You can get them too dense. Experience alone can give the knowledge necessary to determine exactly when and how in this delicate operation. So, as soon as the solution of pyrogallic acid covers the plate and the sky and the highlights of the picture begin to appear on the primrose tinted film of silver iodide, I love that. A few seconds after, the minor details make their appearance, becoming more and more vigorous. If you haven't done this, you do it and you'll know what he's saying there. He goes on to talk about fixing here. Let's talk about the fix. He believes in hypo. He does not use KCN to fix negatives, right? There's some debate back and forth about what's better. Some of the spectrum you get with KCN might be, you know, whatever. It's up to you. You experiment. This, I just translated this quickly. This is about a 200% mixture of thiosulfate, 227 grams, and 1,183 milliliters. You can see that the 183 milliliters over a liter and the 27 grams over the 200. Quick translation, 200%. So he is using a much stronger fix than not a 10 or 15%, a much stronger solution of fix. If you Don't pick and choose. If you try any of these videos, we're talking about making negatives or positives. Don't fudge on these. Put it all together like these operators talk about. Don't take, Estabrooks developer and Monckhoven's collodion and somebody else's developer. Use them all together because it's really important that those three harmonize and work well together. And these guys knew what they were doing. He goes on to talk about varnish. He likes the shellac. So what is gum lac white? That is a de-waxed blonde shellac. Shellac is from the lac bud. It's the feces from the lac bud. Basically, all kinds of bugs give it, but it's a 6% solution. I only use a 3% solution, but that gives you the 2.5 ounces of white shellac, or blonde de-waxed shellac in our case, 71 grams, and 1,035 milliliters of alcohol. So that's a breakdown on Monckhoven's book. It's very, he goes into much more detail. We just don't have the time to do that here, but that gives you a high level view. Let's talk about just quickly, what is a negative? Let's see. Oh, sorry. Hello, Mr. Analog. Good to see you, brother. Dale. Oh, Dale's in here, or at least on Facebook. Is it safe to suggest that a reason advocates of etherless collodion are advocates is that this group is primarily using aluminum and making positives, those making negatives? That's a good explanation, but really what it is, Dale, is more the safety concern of storing the ether and forming peroxides, which I think would be absolutely rare, but I'm not advocating anything. If you don't feel comfortable with cadmium bromide or ether or pyrogallic acid or potassium cyanide, don't use it. Just, you may not be as efficient or in making the images, positives or negatives, but you're right, Dale. You don't need, if you're making alumitypes or tin types as we call them, I call them alumitypes or tin types, it doesn't really matter. You don't need to worry about that etherless collodion or additional etherless collodion not sticking to the plate. There's enough ether in the original collodion to suck down on that metal, and I've never seen an aluminum plate peel, ever. I've never seen that. Glass, on the other hand, is a different story. And if you want to make glass ambrotypes or especially negatives, unless you sub that plate, you're not going to get away with anything. Next week, we're going to look at Eastman Kodak's book on some different subbing properties that you can use on this. But yeah, that's a good point, a very good point. What's the book's name on Google Books? I'm on a mobile phone. The book's name is A Popular Treatise on Photography by Monckhoven, Van Monckhoven. Go into Google Books and search that. You'll find it, free download, etc., etc., etc. I sound like Willy Wonka, don't I? So let's talk about what is a negative. It's very different than a positive. In fact, as I say here, there is no such thing as a positive. There just isn't. Back in the day, I know most of you don't know this, but I worked in film. I worked at newspapers and magazines. I was a photojournalist, periodista, right? I worked at, everything from, AP, Associated Press, freelance for all kinds of them. And I'd go back to the newspaper or magazine or wherever I was working, and I'd develop on my film. I'd be looking at my 35 millimeter film like this against some light, and I'd catch an underexposed frame, and the light behind it was hitting it. Oh my God, that's a positive. Look at that. You can see that as a positive. So, 35 years ago, I was looking at these little tiny positives, underexposed 35 millimeter black and white positives that were really negatives. And that's what this is in this case. When we talk about a positive in wet collodion, we're talking about a very underexposed negative. That's all we're talking about. And we look at it with transmitted light that comes in and hits the surface of the silver and bounces back to our eyes. And it has to be backed with something black, whether it's the material it's on, whether you put velvet or paint it or asphalt them or hold it up against a blackboard, doesn't matter. You're looking at very thin negative with reflected light. Negatives are dense. They use transmitted light because you're going through the glass to print on paper or some other substrate, right? So there's a whole different ballgame. You're going to get a lot more information in a negative than you will a positive. It's just the nature of physics. That's the way it works. Although they're beautiful positives, don't get me wrong. Absolutely, we know that. Hold on here, just 1 second here. Steve says, I'm seeing a weak color of the collodion and a wavy covering of the plate when it comes out of the silver. Okay, yeah, that's a great question. So let's reverse back just for a second here. Absolutely, Farid, no problem. Or Farid, I'm sorry, Farid or Farid. I'm not sure how to pronounce your name. So you're seeing what Steve's talking about here, and correct me if I'm wrong, Steve. If you're not seeing, you don't want a translucent blue coming out of the silver bath on your collodion. You want a somewhat milky, a semi-opaque, milky color coming out of your silver bath. And if you have waves, that probably means that you need to add some more ether to your collodion. It's probably not setting correctly. And if you, Steve, download that book. Monckhoven gives you illustrations of all those things. It's really interesting. He goes into detail about that. So I would say two things. You're looking for a nice, not a thick, milky, that's over-iodized collodion, right? A thick, milky layering coming out of the silver is over-iodized collodion. You don't need that much. You'll just eat up your silver bath. You're looking for a semi-opaque, milky covering, not a transparent blue one. That doesn't work. It's not, especially for negatives. It's not going to work well. So thank you for that, though. So a negative is dense, provides a lot of detail, and uses transmitted light. That's what we're looking at. Prints perfectly on pop or printing out paper. Won't print on modern developing out paper very well. Bright ambrotypes will. I often say that. You're welcome, Steve. So a positive is considered a very thin or underexposed negative. Feeble is the word we use, or they use. In reality, there are no positives in the process, only negatives. It's just a difference on how you process them, what chemistry, exposure, et cetera, et cetera. So again, negatives are viewed with transmitted light, positives are viewed with reflected light. So there's an example of a pop print and one of mine from Ghost Dance there, the keep out tree. Let me show you. This is a collodion chloride print from a wet collodion negative, same from the Ghost Dance, fresh out of the contact printer. There's no audio here, so I'll just talk over it. But I just pulled it right off the negative, and sorry about the quality if it's not very good, high quality. You can see the red color. This is pre-wash, pre-fix, and pre-tone. That's the color you want. I could have printed it a little more dense, but this is on the Burita paper from Canson, which works really well, especially for collodion chloride prints. I free floated onto the paper. I was talking about that in this particular video. And this is pre-wash and pre-fix and pre-tone. Beautiful prints, absolutely. And I'll show you the negative here in just a second. I wanted to free flow that on the paper. And there's the negative. That gives you some idea of the density that you're looking for, especially in the white jaw there and the void areas on the beer can. So let's talk about, this is I apologize. I don't know who this fat guy is in Germany, but he's making a soft negative, okay? He does a pretty good job, I have to admit. He does okay with this. But this is a soft negative. And if you remember the video we did with Estabrook stuff, you'll see what I do here. And in fact, Monckhoven's book, he recommends you start with 5 seconds. You make 5 negatives, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 seconds. And if you read the book, he'll describe that. I start with 5 seconds here. I'm just going to show you the video and let this guy talk about it. This was way back in the day, 11, 12 years ago, something like that.
Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to make 2 negatives of this scene. It's kind of overcast but bright today. And I'm going to make the first exposure at probably 5 seconds, and we'll see what we get. And then
that's a good idea.
Come back and adjust accordingly to make the negative. Exposure 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So here's a 5-second exposure. And as you can see, it's a pretty nice amber type. Can you see that? And you can see the density here.
Which isn't much.
So we want a little more time on that. That's a nice amber type. It would probably print pretty good on modern paper. But let's go ahead and do another one at, like I said, a little longer exposure, probably 8 or 9 seconds. So as you saw, our first negative was a little thin, more like an ambrotype. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the exposure by about a time and a half, probably 8 or 9 seconds, somewhere in there, and see what we get. And then exposure. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Almost 9, really.
So here's our 8.5, 9 second plate now. Now you can see
all the highlights are
it's a little
blown.
blown out, more dense. And you can now get an idea of, before we print it, we're going to intensify it a little bit. So gives you a pretty good idea right there.
I did a whole series on this stuff, but just let's look at this print.
The great thing about printing out paper is that you can check to see where you're at.
I don't know what type of print this was. There we go.
Pulling the print back and taking a look at it, and we're pretty close right there. Might
So
go just a little bit longer.
More important is sorry.
But
more important is the negative making and understanding that you're looking for certain qualities. I recommend that people start with making it positive and then go 1.5 to 2 times more exposure, somewhere in there to start. So 5 seconds would have been 10 seconds for double, and I came pretty close to that right there. I could have probably gone a little more, but I redeveloped that or intensified that or whatever I did. So here is I give a whole slew of options here. But keeping in mind the Estabrooks theories of making this synchronized or harmonized, all of these work together well. The collodion, the silver bath, and the developer. And I'm talking about either the iron developer or the pyro, right? I recommend that if you're interested in making negatives and you really want to make fantastic prints, not kind of mediocre colloidal chloride or you know, even in some of these others that they'll print well on really soft negatives, go for the pyro developer. Go for the 3 grams of pyro, 3 grams of acid, and use that idea that Monckhoven just used. I've got a couple of recipes for gum sander rack. If you like the shellac, get the DWAC Super Blind. You can find that pretty much anywhere. They usually sell it in about 4 ounce lots. And notice it's a little different. The 500, 400 milliliters of ethanol, 20, half the lavender oil. It's just a different constitution of the varnish itself and how it reacts. So that's a difference there. And if you want, you can use the hypo for your negatives or use the KCN. I've tried the Monckhoven and see what happens with your negatives. Pyro is going to change your world. If you're not developing your negatives with pyro right now, that will change your world. So there's some possibilities there. And you can pause that. So let's go to Jeffrey's question. I appreciate you sending this in, Jeffrey. So he says, when preparing the solutions or prepping for the solution for redevelopment, this is redevelopment of the negative to bring that density out. And I redevelop like 99% of my negatives. In fact, even if I have a good foundation negative, I might just do a cup over that just to snap it up. He asks, the iodine mixture part A and the pyro mixture part B, do they have a shelf life? The iodine does not. It does not have a shelf life. So you can store that. You can mix it up. It's convenient. Store it 1 liter. It only takes a little bit, just a little bit of meniscus over the plate to rehalogenate that silver. But as we said and Monckhoven addressed, the pyro does. That oxidizes fast and it will deteriorate and you won't get the performance you want out of it, especially mixing. There's a process that happens mixing with that free silver nitrate. So yes, mix your pyro, the amount you're going to use. If you have 10 negatives, you might want to mix 400 or 500 milliliters of it and use it all up and mix it fresh every single time. And moreover, just like he suggests, store your powdered pyrogallic acid close tight, stoppered, dark, and cool, just like any other compound would be. So that's a good question. Let's see. Okay. Okay, so back to Farid, or Farid. I'll say Farid. I'm sorry. Mr. Lade. Quinn, I just went over my negative process and had to leave the plate in the room with burning eyes. What's happening with the iodine during the activation of the plate? Well, it's not that. What's happening is you've got the ether and the alcohol, and if you're using cadmium, you're going to have, he's talking about the fumes coming off, I would imagine. That's more collodion, right? That's more collodion based. And what's happening in the bath is a double decomposition process, right? You're changing those salts into silver iodide and silver bromide. And the only smell you should get off of that are the solvents. Pablo says, Jeffrey, what percentage of fixer, if one is to redevelop, does the percentage really matter? No, 15 to 20% is great. No, absolutely not. And you're going to redevelop, it's fine. Pablo says 1-year-old pyro works well enough. Yes, it probably does. I've experienced the same thing, but make fresh and watch the difference. You'll see the difference. It's crazy. It does oxidize. Yes, it will work, but you're not going to get the performance out of it that you would normally. And if you have it mixed, use it. I mean, obviously, but try not to mix up a whole bunch of pyro if you can. So yes. So let's. You can bring in your questions. We're going to move on here. We have just a few minutes. I want to introduce you to my new project. The title may change, but it's called People of the Red Earth right now. Sacred Sites and Objects. So these images to the right on the screen are Garden of the Gods, which is, I don't know, 45 minutes, an hour from me, maybe drive. And the top one in the back, you can see Tava or Pikes Peak. That's 14,000 feet up. That's a sacred mountain. The Ute Indians believed that all their spirits went to the top of Tava and drifted up into the clouds for the Creator to absorb. That's where they believe heaven was above Tava, or they call it Sun Mountain. So my new project is about the area of the people of the past where I lived, the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. The Ute called them the Shining Mountains. And we know how much sun we get here. I always brag about that. That's why they were called that. This area is home to the Ute Indians since the beginning of time. The Ute have no migration story. In fact, some of the elders say they've been here for 14,000 years. Garden of the Gods, it's what the white folks call it. Geologists say that's about 300 million years old. This area was home to the Ute since the beginning of time. They say they were created in the area known as Garden of the Gods, or the Garden of Eden. They called this area the Red Earth. They were known as the people of the Red Earth, or the mountain people. So my work consists of two subjects: sacred rock formations and culturally modified trees. And I want to talk to you about those. It will be made with the wet collodion process, 1851, consisting of about 20 plates. Whole plate size is the format I'm going to use. Wet collodion negatives. The negatives will be printed on glass, the same size, using the Rollins oil printing technique. This will allow me to do two things: make the glass prints in color. The rich red soil provides a color for the pigment prints, so I'm going to use the soil from these areas to mix in with the lithographic ink and make the color for the prints. Will be red highlights and then a dark brown or black for the midtones and shadows, going some red in the midtones as well. And it will also allow me to frame the glass images in custom-made ponderosa pine frames that I started playing with here. I've got a lot of ponderosa pines on my land. These are what mostly the culturally modified trees were made from. So it's coming from both the soil, the colors coming from the soil, the land, and the trees will frame these images. So these are the trees that you used to mark sacred places, people, and certain religious rituals. The ponderosa pine can live up to 800 years. My goal is with this is to accomplish two things with the work: enlighten the general public to the past of the people that lived on this land for thousands of years and show what they considered sacred and meaningful. And two, gives me kind of a poetic license to make beautiful moving work of the place that I live and I love so much. And I absolutely do. This is, I want to talk just a little bit about culturally modified trees. These are trees that when they're growing, they manipulate the growth to point to directions or mark sacred locations. So throughout the traditional Ute ancestral lands, hundreds of culturally scarred trees have been identified. These are known as culturally modified trees, or CMTs. In the Tava Mountain or the Pikes Peak area where I live, these have been mapped and recorded by the Pikes Peak Historical Society, fluorescent fossil beds, which I live very close to, the National Monument, and independent experts such as archaeologist Marilyn Maturano and John Anderson. I've talked to John Anderson, given me some information. These culturally scarred or modified trees come in several different types. There's medicine trees, there are prayer trees, message trees, and burial trees. This one I just photographed on my property here. I'll show you. This is a prayer tree, a unique variety of CMT that were skillfully cultivated by the Ute Indians throughout much of Colorado. The Ute began modifying trees for navigational, medicinal, nutritional, educational, and burial or spiritual purposes hundreds of years ago. Many Ute prayer trees can still be found today, and some are believed to have been cultivated between 150 and 450 years ago. The Ute do not have a traditional migration story, like I said, so it remains somewhat of a mystery where they may have come from or when they arrived in what they're known as the Shining Mountains. But according to the Ute oral history of their creation story, says that they were placed here at the beginning of time by their creator, Senewa. So this is a culturally modified ponderosa pine on my property. As you can see, I did a close-up here on the right. What happens as the tree grows, obviously it's going to grow straight up like this. I'll take branches and point. This happens to point in the general direction of Tava, which is a sacred mountain to them. Some of them are burial sites where maybe conflict had taken place, or a warrior has fought, or a great medicine woman or man. So there's a lot of interesting trees and other artifacts. This is another, as I hiked my land, I found this, basically this dish. And I have these interesting stone formations on my property as well. Maybe next time I'll show you, it's like a little Stonehenge. It's not natural. Human beings at some point made it happen. And I live in a very remote place. There's not a lot of people driving by. In fact, you can't drive by my property. It's impossible. You can fly over it, but you can't drive by it. This is, and look on the right side, you'll see that tree. You'll see that could be another modified tree as well too. There's a lot of them. If you search culturally modified trees, Ute, Colorado, you'll see prayer trees that grow the stalk up, and the stalk goes horizontal and then again. They say they're born, they live their life, and then they ascended. So those would be considered a burial tree, probably. Again, I'm researching, and I have been for a while on this. These will be included with rock formations, CMTs, and be kind of a unique process to go through. And I'll show you this. I'll show you. I'll go in my darkroom. I'll go out during the week and make plates and come back. I'll film things. I'll show you what I'm doing if you're interested in seeing. Linda says, I know that you used ash in your other body. Yes, I used carbon. You're right, Linda. She's talking about the 3 dead sunflowers. I turned into carbon and put in and made a carbon print of that plate at the massacre site at Sand Creek. You're absolutely right. Yes, I'm using the soil, the red soil from the earth here. It's called the red earth, or people of the red earth, the Utes. I'm using that red to make the ink to do the oil printing on this. So thank you. I find it interesting as well too. That's kind of where I'm at with those things. So anyway, I wanted to give you a quick introduction. I'll jot out some more as I go along. Things are subject to change. I'm still, I've researched this for a couple of years. I'm still working on it. There's still a lot of locations I have to go to. Times of year, it probably take me a year or two to do a significant body of work. So hang in there if you're interested. I'll show you some plates. It should be interesting. I'll take you on the journey at least. Before we do recommended reading, let's look at. I got 5% iodine solution. I mix up this little proportion. Oh, sorry. You're talking about redevelop. I'm sorry, Mr. Lade. What's burning your eyes is a strong mixture of iodine. That's what's coming up. That's the iodine. Yeah, iodine can, yes, exactly. It's iodine. It probably mix it a little weaker, make a light red solution. It might take you a little longer. Tim Fry, and thank you last week for Tim. You did a great job. He said he was using a little too strong mixture of iodine. That can really fume up. And if you're not ventilated well, that'll burn your nose and your eyes both. So ventilate well, mix your iodine a little weaker. 5%, maybe you go to 2.5%, half that. Yeah. So I misunderstood that. I'm sorry. Okay, Tom says, varnishing, I can get a smooth finish on tin, but with glass negative, I'm getting flow light. Yes, exactly. So aluminum or tin heats up very quickly and dissipates the heat quickly. Glass takes more time, but it will retain the heat longer, Tom. So you're absolutely right. You're spot on with that question and answer. So recommended reading. Paul Smith, my mate over in the UK there, we talk semi-frequently. Oh, thank you, Jeffrey. Looking forward to see your new bike. Thank you. I'll try to show you as much as I can of it being made too. Be kind of interesting. I'll take my GoPro out on sites. I'll take you into the darkroom and studio. You can see the final prints on glass, the coloring, all that stuff. I like to show the process. The process is meaningful to this work because it's going to both, like I said, it's going to involve both the land, both in the trees of the frame, the ponderosa pine, and the rich red soil that I'll make the ink from or the pigment from. So yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And Pablo says, back to clothing formula for negatives. In your book, you mentioned 5 grams of ammonium iodide. Is that, yes, you can use cadmium iodide instead. Absolutely, Pablo. Good point. That will extend the life of your collodion. And if you match that with everything else, or you take Monckhoven's formulas if you want to use those. But yes, substituting the iodides, no problem at all. It's just going to give you a longer shelf life. It'd be interesting to see if you like it or not. So let's see comments. Okay, so Paul, Paul inspired me. He went to the V&A Victoria Albert Museum there, and I think it's in London. And Julia Margaret Cameron, I'm going to talk about this eventually. My new body of work will be in the style of pictorialism or neo-pictorialism, and I'll talk about that in the future. But Julia Margaret Cameron was considered kind of a pictorialist at the time because her negatives had fingerprints and marks and all kind of like an old Sally Mann-ish kind of thing, right? Sally Mann would be considered more neo-pictorialist as well. Why I want to work in this style, because I don't want my work to be seen as documentary as much. Like I said, I want a little more poetic license to make kind of beautiful work. And these will, I've ran a little bit on it before we moved, and I'm really excited. These are going to be absolutely beautiful glass prints. And I'm even thinking about, as the whole plate is framed in this beautiful old ponderosa pine from the land, I may illuminate it from the back as well with a small LED light. So it'll be kind of transcend photography and become kind of multimedia, and that the red will shine. There's a whole bunch of metaphors to use there, but Julia Margaret Cameron, and I'll talk about her more in the future as well too. She was considered a pictorialist, or at least in the rearview mirror, hindsight, she was definitely considered a pictorialist. And she was born in 1815, and she didn't take up wet plate until the mid-1860s. She had kind of a hard time learning the process. And of course, she didn't do positives. She made negatives, right? So she did prints. But she was married to a wealthy man, came from wealth. So she photographed Sir John Herschel, Tennyson, all kinds of famous people at the time. She brought everyone out to her darkroom. She did this allegorical work. She really, there are Tennyson, Herschel, Carlyle, etc. She brought a different look and feel to the work that was being done at the time. And so This is a catalog raison, or a complete logical catalog of all of her work. You can find it, online. You can easily search for that and find it. The complete photographs. Beautiful, stunning work. Absolutely beautiful. I highly recommend you looking at that. And I just wanted to show you a little bit. It's recommended watching, but you can watch it right here. I'm just going to show you this. This is on the 200th bicentenary, 200th anniversary of her birth. So 2015, this was made. And just check this out. You'll get a little taste of her if you haven't seen her work before. All wet collodion, usually albumin printed.
Julia Margaret Cameron was one of the most important and innovative photographers of the 19th century. She was born in 1815, but she didn't take up photography until the 1860s. In 1863, she was 48 years old, and she was given a camera as a present. She was an amazingly energetic woman, and she just threw herself into photography. She was a pioneering portrait photographer. She worked exclusively in portraiture, and she photographed many of the leading intellectuals and artists of her own time. She also made staged photographs of tableaus based on stories from literature or history, and also made numerous religious subjects as well. Her sitters were drawn from her intellectual and artistic circle, and as well as her own household staff. She photographed her own domestic servants repeatedly, and she was also a wonderful photographer of children. In 1865, the South Kensington Museum acquired from Julia Margaret Cameron 114 photographs. These photographs are still in the museum's collection, and today the V&A has over 250 photographs by Julia Margaret Cameron. Our Cameron holdings are really some of the treasures of our collection, and by studying these original photographs, we can learn so much more about her process, about her intentions, about what she was trying to do with these photographs, how she wanted them presented, and how they might have been understood at the time that she was making them. Not only did Julia Margaret Cameron exhibit her photographs at the South Kensington Museum in 1865, the same year that the museum collected her work. In 1868, she used 2 rooms at the museum as a studio, perhaps qualifying her as its first artist in residence.
Sir John Herschel.
This is Henry Cole's diary from 1868. Henry Cole was the founding director of the South Kensington Museum, which is now the Victoria and Albert Museum. Just as for Cameron herself, her professional activities were very much intertwined with her social life. And on the 14th of March, 1868, Henry Cole records in his diary, "After lunch with Mrs. Cameron, who took 6 negative portraits of me." So this gives us some indication of how many tries it might have taken to get a successful portrait.
Julia Margaret Cameron is my great-great-great-grandmother, and I'm descended from her son, Eugene. So I'm the 3rd generation grandchildren, and I'm also Julia Margaret Cameron. There was definitely a presence in the household. I mean, there was all of her books around, and we did have a few prints, and when we go visit family, they'd often talk about her. But actually, when I started being interested in photography, I was a bit older, I would start coming to the V&A and finding out more about her, and the more you find out, the more you want to know, and then I was kind of looking to find out about her and her character and her as a woman as well as a photographer. So this is the first time I've actually seen her letters in physical form, which is just incredible. I'm just really inspired, and she, it's amazing. She's got this really powerful energy that comes through her letters. So it's amazing to actually be able to see them in person. 20th of May, 1865. My dear Mr. Cole, I have real pleasure in telling you that Mr. Watts thinks my photograph of you extremely fine. 21st of February, 1866. My dear Mr. Cole, I write to you if you'll be having any photographic soiree. or meeting soon, which I have so perpetually remembered all your helping kindness and ever-friendly hand to me in the earlier years of my art, that I delight in now sending you my last portrait of Alfred Tennyson, which I think you will agree with me in feeling is a national treasure of immense value. I will come up and work with renewed energy at your museum, so that I'm eager for an answer, and I know that your kindness needs no fanning into action. Yours very truly, with my love to your wife and to Alan, and to yours ever, Julia Margaret Cameron.
She was using the wet collodion process, and this was a very cumbersome process. The photographs were made onto glass plates. These are large glass plates. All of her prints are contact prints. So whenever you see a Julia Margaret Cameron print, you know that the negative had to be at least as large as the image that you're looking at. So these are large glass plates, they're fragile, and they have to be coated with a number of different substances at different stages in their processing. There are a lot of opportunities to make mistakes. And Cameron was a very exuberant character, and you feel her energy when you look at her photographs. She was so excited about this new way that she was making art, that she was expressing herself artistically. In Cameron's photographs, there are all sorts of things that other photographers would have dismissed as flaws, but what she seemed to embrace. So, for example, there are smudges, there are even her own fingerprints sometimes on the photographs embedded into the photographic negative. There are smears, there are swirls. And today, I think those imperfections are very attractive to contemporary audiences because we can see that these are handmade objects. These aren't the cold, precise results of a machine. And we really get a sense of an individual artist who produced these works of art.
So there you go. Very, very interesting. Very, very interesting artist, photographer. And yes, there's comments. She made just beautiful. I totally agree, Linda. She made beautiful photographs. And you're right. This is the most astonishing thing about her as a female, as a woman doing this kind of work. And I guess she was quite gregarious and quite outgoing and jovial. And like she said, very passionate about, she loved making portraits. She was like absolutely enamored with it. But as a woman in the mid 19th century doing this and starting at almost age 50, 48 years old, amazing. And she did work, from what I understand, whole plate and larger. And you're right, the contact printing. From what I understand, she struggled with the process, but embraced that struggle, like the narrator said there. And her work just wonderful. It's part. That's what I try to do. I try to blend this fine line between some documentary and fine artwork and kind of blur those lines a little bit. And that's kind of what she did a lot of the times, right? With Tennyson and Herschel and Darwin and all these people. I mean, those were documentary photographs, but very, very pictorialistic, very artistic, very painterly, very all those things. She embraced those kind of artifacts and all that stuff. So, yeah, I think it's amazing why people and why today especially. I was fortunate. I went to the George Eastman house and got to go through some of her prints. It was just amazing to see them, and they were quite large, but just beautiful. Mostly albumin at 90+% albumin. That's pretty much what she printed on. Exactly. There was a couple of the size of the prints were large. Yes, she did. She made very large, and really, the typical theory, especially 19th century, was whole plate was kind of the beginning of the contact printing for acceptable sizes. So she was up there. And then later on you had all the large landscape work, Jackson and what, all those guys out there doing that. Yeah, Tim. Yes. Well, Stieglitz, yeah, there's the whole thing, you can read about the history of photography, the succession, the photo succession, we go in these waves, right? Straight, black and white, silver gelatin prints, sharp edge to edge, and internal depth of field, to this like crazy painterly, pictorialistic kind of things. And I think really, here's just real quick, I'll share this with you. My philosophy is, as I get older, and I've been doing photography since 1982, right? I have 2 degrees in it, all that stuff, right? So I've dedicated my entire life to it. But early on, I go through phases. There's periods in your life, and the older I get, the more poetic I want to take that license. I want to do those kinds of things. And she didn't start until she was almost 50, and I can understand that. The older I get, the work I want to make is not necessarily documentary, but it has an element of truth to it. It has some interest, connection to the human, the ontological, the being question of being a human, but still taking that poetic license and making painterly work. I always say I'm a frustrated painter. That's why I use a Petzval f2.8 lens, right? That beautiful painterly stuff that happens in those images. So, you go through phases in your life, making art, they change, it changes, you have different desires and outcomes and everything. And I think when I look at her work and I look at the history of photography, in Linda's words, she was way ahead of her time. She was, as a woman, she was doing things that no one, male or female, were doing. And she didn't care. She went forward with it. So, and thank God she did, because we have some really wonderful, wonderful work from her to learn from and to appreciate, more importantly. And April says, I can relate to starting this process later in years. Sure. Regardless of when you, there you go, Steve. Neo-pictorialism, absolutely. I'm going to talk about, I've started writing about this stuff. I'm going to talk to you guys about that in the future. Absolutely. It doesn't matter what era you come to this process in. You can work in any styles or you do your own thing. There's no hard and fast rules that way. I think there are some things that people should consider when making work. And if you want to engage people, or if you want to ask a question, or if you have a concern, or you want to bring people in to have conversations, I think artwork, to a large degree, should be somewhat socially active and be a catalyst for conversation, right? So if your work can bring people in and start conversation and beyond the technical, right? Beyond, what lens did you, what kind of collodion is that? That's fine, like I was saying in the beginning, but at some point you want to make work that has some substance, that has some longevity, and that can start some conversations or engage people or inspire people, those kinds of things. I think, in Becker's words, Ernest Becker's would call that self-esteem, or our immortality projects, right? Things we do to fight off that oncoming death. I'm fully aware that I'm going to die. And one of my management tools is art. One of my tools to manage that is to make work that will live way beyond my life and hopefully inspire other people. That's the best we can do. So anyway, that's kind of where I'm at. Well, thank you, Jeffrey. I see why you didn't used to use gloves. Pablo, right? Or wear safety goggles or respirators or anything. Yes, this is all a journey that we're all on, and coming together as a community like this, whether you're in here live now watching it or you watch it 10 years from now, all we want to do is help people learn the process, all those technical things, and see what options are out there and the best way we can do it. We talk safety, we talk all that kind of stuff, but ultimately we have to have the conversation about why we're doing this, right? Why are we making the work? What is it that we want to accomplish? What are our goals? And I think that's the most powerful thing. Like Tim came on last week, and again, thank you, Tim, for that, and shared both his project and his ideas and his struggles and his successes, all that stuff. Really important. Nobody's perfect in this. Nobody's trying to be a deity here. We're just trying to lay out our struggles and our thoughts, and does this work, doesn't it work, what do you guys think about this? And I'm going to try to be fully transparent on this project that I'm doing, and I'll share with you a little bit as time goes on and we get out in the dark room in the studio. I'll share what I'm doing and how I'm doing it, and see if it interests you, see if it inspires you, see if it gives you, something to throw a little pebble in your shoe, right? Kind of get you agitated, so to speak, or makes you interested in something you didn't know about. That's what I love about art. Art always teaches me something, always. Whether it's technical, whether it's expressive, whether it's even documentary or true history, that kind of stuff. So, oh, well, thank you, Will. I appreciate you coming in every week, brother. That means a lot to me. And again, gracias to you, Pablo. I appreciate that. Again, spending your time on a weekend with me. You could be anywhere. You could be sleeping rather than being here. So I greatly appreciate your time. And I hope you come back next week. We'll continue on with negatives. Next week, I want to look at Eastman Kodak's book. And we're going to derive a couple of nuggets out of there for you, for your negatives, which are really good. And we'll come back and we'll just have another conversation. Thank you for your time. Stay healthy, stay happy, and thank you. And we'll see you next Saturday. Have a good weekend or good day. Bye-bye.